The arrival. The town of Willowbrook had always been a quiet, unassuming place. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, and secrets were hard to keep. But all of that changed the day the stranger arrived. It was a crisp autumn morning when the first rumors began to circulate. A man, or at least something that looked like a man, had been seen walking down Main Street. He was tall, with an air of quiet confidence, and his eyes seemed to pierce through anyone who dared to meet his gaze. He wore a long, dark coat that fluttered in the wind, and his footsteps made no sound as he moved. By midday, the entire town was abuzz with speculation. Who was this stranger? Where had he come from? And why was he here? The questions swirled through the streets like leaves caught in a gust of wind, but no one had any answers. It wasn't long before the stranger began to make his presence known in more unsettling ways. He would approach people on the street, calling them by name, and then proceed to reveal things about them that no one else could possibly know. He spoke of hidden affairs, long-buried regrets, and secrets that had been carefully guarded for years. The first to experience this was Mrs. Henderson, the town's beloved librarian. She was arranging books in the library when the stranger walked in. Without a word, he handed her a book, a rare first edition she had been searching for her entire life. When she looked up, startled, he simply said, "You've been looking for this for a long time, haven't you, Margaret? Ever since your husband left you for that woman in the city." Mrs. Henderson's face turned pale, and she dropped the book. The stranger didn't wait for a response. He simply turned and walked out, leaving her trembling in his wake. Word of the encounter spread quickly, and soon the entire town was on edge. People began to avoid the stranger, crossing the street when they saw him coming, or ducking into shops to avoid his gaze. But no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't escape him. He seemed to know where they would be before they did, and he always found a way to confront them with their deepest, darkest secrets. As the days passed, the town's fear grew. The stranger's presence was like a shadow that loomed over Willowbrook, casting a pall over everything. People began to lock their doors at night, and the streets, once bustling with life, grew eerily quiet. But amidst the fear and confusion, there was one person who was determined to uncover the truth. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she was a journalist for the Willowbrook Gazette. Sarah had always been curious, with a nose for a good story, and she couldn't resist the mystery of the stranger. She decided to approach him to try to get an interview. She knew it was risky. After all, the stranger had a way of getting under people's skin, but she was determined to find out who he was and why he had come to Willowbrook. One evening, as the sun was setting and the streets were bathed in a golden light, Sarah found the stranger standing by the old oak tree in the town square. He was staring up at the branches, his expression unreadable. She took a deep breath and approached him, her notebook clutched tightly in her hand. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm a journalist, and I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions." The stranger turned to look at her, and for a moment, she felt as though he could see right through her. Then he smiled, a small, enigmatic smile, and nodded. "Of course, Sarah," he said. "I've been expecting you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. How did he know her name? But she pushed the thought aside and began to ask her questions. She started with the basics: his name, where he was from, why he had come to Willowbrook. But the stranger's answers were vague, evasive. "I go by many names," he said, "and I come from a place far beyond your understanding. As for why I'm here, let's just say I have a purpose." Sarah frowned. "A purpose? What kind of purpose?" The stranger's smile widened, and his eyes gleamed with a strange, otherworldly light. "I'm here to reveal the truth," he said. "The truth that lies buried beneath the surface of this town. The truth that no one wants to face." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What truth?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The stranger leaned in close, his breath cold against her ear. "The truth about what really happened to Mary Jones." Sarah's blood ran cold. Mary Jones had been a young girl who had disappeared from Willowbrook 10 years ago. Her disappearance had never been solved, and it had haunted the town ever since. The stranger's words sent a shiver through her, and she took a step back, her mind racing. "What do you know about Mary Jones?" she demanded. The stranger's smile didn't waver. "I know everything," he said, "and soon so will you." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone in the square, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to think, but one thing was clear. The stranger was no ordinary man. He was something else entirely, and she was determined to find out what. As she walked back to her office, her mind was filled with questions. Who was this stranger? What did he know about Mary Jones? And what was the truth he was so determined to reveal? She didn't have the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The investigation. Sarah spent the rest of the evening in her small office above the Willowbrook Gazette, poring over old newspaper clippings and police reports related to Mary Jones's disappearance. The case had been cold for years, but the stranger's cryptic words had reignited her curiosity. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something the town had buried and forgotten. The next morning, Sarah decided to start her investigation by speaking to those who had been closest to Mary. Her first stop was the Jones family home, a modest house on the edge of town. Mary's parents, John and Linda Jones, still lived there, though the years had not been kind to them. The loss of their daughter had left them hollow, their faces etched with grief. When Sarah knocked on the door, Linda answered, her eyes widening in surprise. "Sarah, what brings you here?" "I'm working on a story," Sarah said carefully, not wanting to upset the fragile woman. "About Mary. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions." Linda hesitated, then nodded and stepped aside to let Sarah in. The house was quiet, the air heavy with the weight of memories. John Jones sat in the living room, staring blankly at the television, though it wasn't turned on. He barely acknowledged Sarah's presence. "We've told the police everything we know," Linda said as she sat down at the kitchen table. "There's nothing new to say." Sarah leaned forward, her voice gentle. "I know this is difficult, but I think there might be more to Mary's story than anyone realizes. A stranger came to town recently, and he mentioned her name. He said he knows what happened to her." Linda's hands trembled as she clutched her coffee cup. "What stranger? What does he know?" "I'm not sure," Sarah admitted, "but I'm trying to find out. Did Mary ever mention anything unusual before she disappeared? Anything that might help me understand?" Linda shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. She was just a normal girl, happy, full of life. She loved school, her friends. She didn't have any secrets. Sarah glanced at John, who remained silent, his gaze fixed on the wall. She sensed there was something he wasn't saying, but she didn't press him. Instead, she thanked Linda for her time and left, her mind racing. Her next stop was the high school, where Mary had been a student. The principal, Mr. Thompson, was reluctant to discuss the case at first, but Sarah's persistence eventually wore him down. "Mary was a bright student," Mr. Thompson said, his voice tinged with sadness. "She had a lot of friends, and she was involved in several extracurricular activities. But there was one thing, something that always struck me as odd." Sarah's ears perked up. "What was it?" "A few weeks before she disappeared, Mary started spending a lot of time in the library. She would stay after school, sometimes for hours, poring over old books and newspapers. When I asked her what she was researching, she just smiled and said it was a personal project." Sarah's heart raced. "Do you know what she was looking for?" Mr. Thompson shook his head. "No, but I remember she seemed different, more serious, like she was carrying a heavy burden. I thought it was just teenage angst, but looking back, I wonder if she knew something dangerous." Sarah thanked Mr. Thompson and left the school, her mind buzzing with questions. What had Mary been researching, and how did it connect to her disappearance? As she walked back to her office, she noticed the stranger standing at the edge of the town square, watching her. His dark coat billowed in the wind, and his eyes seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. Sarah hesitated, then approached him. "What do you know about Mary Jones?" she demanded, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. The stranger smiled, his expression inscrutable. "I know the truth," he said, "but the truth is not always easy to bear. Are you sure you're ready to hear it?" Sarah swallowed hard. "Yes, tell me." The stranger's gaze bore into her, and for a moment, she felt as though he could see into her very soul. "Mary discovered something," he said. "Something the town has been hiding for generations. She was close to uncovering it, but someone stopped her. Someone who couldn't let the truth come to light." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Who? Who stopped her?" The stranger's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "That, Sarah, is the question you must answer. But be careful. The truth has a way of destroying those who seek it." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing in the square, her mind reeling. She didn't know what to make of his words, but one thing was clear. She was getting closer to the truth. And the closer she got, the more dangerous it became. The hidden past. Sarah spent the next few days digging deeper into Mary Jones's life, determined to uncover the truth the stranger had hinted at. Her investigation led her to the town's archives, a dusty room in the basement of the Willowbrook Public Library. The archives were filled with old records, newspapers, and documents dating back to the town's founding. If Mary had been researching something, this was where she would have started. As Sarah sifted through the yellowed pages, she found herself drawn to a series of articles from the late 1800s. They spoke of a mysterious event that had occurred in Willowbrook, a fire that had destroyed several homes on the outskirts of town. The fire had been blamed on a lightning strike, but there were whispers of something more sinister. Some of the articles mentioned a group of townspeople who had been accused of witchcraft, though the details were vague. Sarah's curiosity was piqued. She began to cross-reference the articles with other records, and soon she discovered a pattern. Every few decades, there was a similar event, a fire, a disappearance, or some other tragedy that seemed to coincide with rumors of witchcraft or other supernatural occurrences. The town had always dismissed these rumors as superstition, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Her investigation took a darker turn when she stumbled upon a faded photograph tucked between the pages of an old ledger. The photograph showed a group of people standing in front of a large, ornate house. The house was unfamiliar to Sarah, but the people in the photograph were not. Among them was a young girl who bore a striking resemblance to Mary Jones. Sarah's heart raced as she studied the photograph. How was this possible? Mary had disappeared 10 years ago, but the photograph looked much older. She turned the photo over and found a handwritten note on the back. "The Blackwood family, 1897. The name Blackwood rang a bell. Sarah remembered hearing it in passing, but she couldn't recall the context. She decided to ask around, starting with the town's oldest residents. Her first stop was the home of Mr. Harold Jenkins, a retired history teacher who had lived in Willowbrook his entire life. Harold was in his 80s, but his mind was still sharp, and he had a wealth of knowledge about the town's history. "The Blackwoods," Harold said when Sarah showed him the photograph. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in a long time. They were one of the founding families of Willowbrook, but they disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some say they were involved in dark practices, witchcraft, rituals, that sort of thing. Others say they were just eccentric. Either way, they were shunned by the rest of the town." Sarah leaned forward, her notebook in hand. "Do you know what happened to them?" Harold shook his head. "No one knows for sure. Their house burned down one night, and the family was never seen again. Some say they died in the fire, but others believe they fled. There were rumors that they had uncovered something the town didn't want anyone to know about." Sarah's mind raced. Could the Blackwoods be connected to Mary's disappearance? And if so, how? She thanked Harold and left, her thoughts swirling. As she walked back to her office, she noticed the stranger standing in the shadows of an alleyway. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. Sarah hesitated, then approached him. "What do you know about the Blackwoods?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease creeping over her. The stranger's lips curved into a faint smile. "The Blackwoods were guardians," he said. "Guardians of a secret so powerful, it could destroy this town. But they were betrayed, and their legacy was buried." Mary Jones stumbled upon that legacy, and it cost her everything. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What legacy? What are you talking about?" The stranger's eyes glowed with an eerie light. "The Blackwoods were not just a family, Sarah. They were protectors of a gateway to another dimension. A dimension where beings like me exist. The town feared what they didn't understand, and they destroyed the Blackwoods to keep the gateway closed. But the gateway still exists, hidden beneath the town. And Mary found it." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What happened to her? The stranger's smile faded, and his expression grew somber. "She was taken," he said. "Taken by those who guard the gateway. They couldn't risk her revealing the truth. But the gateway is weakening, Sarah. And when it opens, the consequences will be catastrophic." Sarah's mind reeled. She didn't know what to believe, but the stranger's words had the ring of truth. She had to find out more about the Blackwoods, about the gateway, and about what had really happened to Mary. As she turned to leave, the stranger spoke again, his voice low and urgent. "Be careful, Sarah. The truth is dangerous, and there are those who will do anything to protect it. Trust no one." Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what she was getting herself into, but she couldn't stop now. The truth was out there, and she was determined to find it. The gateway. Sarah's investigation led her to the outskirts of Willowbrook, where the dense forest gave way to an overgrown, forgotten part of town. According to old maps she had found in the archives, this was where the Blackwood estate had once stood. The house itself was long gone, reduced to ashes in the fire of 1897, but the land remained, a silent witness to the secrets buried beneath it. As she trudged through the underbrush, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves absent. The air was thick with tension, as if the very land was holding its breath. When she finally reached the site of the Blackwood estate, all that remained was a crumbling stone foundation, half buried in the earth. Vines and moss clung to the stones, and the ground was littered with debris. Sarah knelt down, brushing away the dirt to reveal a large, circular symbol carved into one of the stones. It was intricate with strange, otherworldly patterns that seemed to shift and twist when she looked at them too long. "The gateway," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She pulled out her notebook and began to sketch the symbol, her hands trembling slightly. As she worked, she noticed something else. A faint, almost imperceptible hum emanating from the ground beneath her. It was a low, resonant sound, like the distant rumble of thunder, and it sent a shiver down her spine. Sarah stood up, her heart pounding. She knew she was onto something, but she also knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed help, someone who understood the town's history and could help her piece together the mystery of the Blackwoods and the gateway. Her thoughts turned to Dr. Evelyn Hart, a retired professor of folklore and mythology who lived in Willowbrook. Dr. Hart had written several books on local legends and was known for her encyclopedic knowledge of the town's past. If anyone could help Sarah make sense of what she had found, it was her. Sarah made her way to Dr. Hart's house, a quaint cottage on the edge of town. The professor greeted her warmly, though her expression grew serious when Sarah explained why she had come. "The Blackwoods," Dr. Hart said, her voice tinged with both curiosity and caution. "That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. Come in, my dear. We have much to discuss." Over tea, Sarah showed Dr. Hart the symbol she had sketched and told her about the hum she had felt at the Blackwood estate. The professor's eyes widened as she studied the drawing. "This is no ordinary symbol," Dr. Hart said. "It's a sigil, a powerful one. If what you say is true, it's possible that the Blackwoods were indeed guardians of a gateway to another dimension. Such gateways are rare, but they do exist. And if this one is weakening—" She trailed off, her expression grave. Sarah leaned forward, her voice urgent. "What happens if it opens?" Dr. Hart sighed. If the gateway opens, it could unleash forces beyond our understanding. Beings from another dimension, entities that are not bound by our laws of physics or morality. The consequences could be catastrophic, not just for Willowbrook, but for the world. Sarah's mind raced. She thought of the stranger, his cryptic warnings, and his claim that Mary had been taken by those who guarded the gateway. If the gateway was real, then so was the danger. "We have to stop it," Sarah said. "We have to find a way to close the gateway before it's too late." Dr. Hart nodded, though her expression was troubled. "It won't be easy. The Blackwoods were the last known guardians, and their knowledge died with them. But there may be a way." According to legend, the gateway can only be sealed by someone who possesses the Blackwood bloodline, a direct descendant of the family. Sarah's eyes widened. A descendant? But the Blackwoods disappeared over a century ago. How would we even find one? Dr. Hart hesitated, then stood and walked over to a bookshelf. She pulled out an old, leather-bound journal and handed it to Sarah. "This belonged to my grandmother. She was a historian like me, and she spent years researching the Blackwoods. According to her notes, there was one survivor of the fire, a young girl named Eleanor Blackwood. She was taken in by a family in a neighboring town and changed her name to protect her identity. If we can find her descendants, we might have a chance." Sarah's heart leapt with hope. "Do you know where to start looking?" Dr. Hart nodded. "There's a family in the next town over, the Graysons. They've always been secretive, but my grandmother believed they were connected to the Blackwoods. It's a long shot, but it's the only lead we have." Sarah thanked Dr. Hart and left, her mind buzzing with possibilities. She knew time was running out, but she also knew she couldn't give up. The fate of Willowbrook, and perhaps the world, depended on her. As she walked back to her car, she noticed the stranger standing at the edge of the forest, watching her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of something in his eyes. Approval, perhaps, or maybe even pity. "You're getting closer," he said, his voice low and resonant. "But the closer you get, the more dangerous it becomes. The Guardians will not let you succeed without a fight." Sarah met his gaze, her resolve unwavering. "I don't care. I have to try." The stranger nodded, his expression solemn. "Then I wish you luck, Sarah Mitchell. You'll need it." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Sarah standing alone in the fading light. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain. She was ready to face it, the final secret. Sarah's search for the Grayson family led her to the neighboring town of Ashgrove, a quiet, unassuming place much like Willowbrook. The Graysons lived in an old, ivy-covered house on the edge of town, and Sarah's heart pounded as she approached the front door. She had no idea what she would say or how they would react, but she knew she had to try. When she knocked, the door was opened by a middle-aged woman with sharp features and piercing green eyes. She looked at Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm a journalist from Willowbrook, and I'm looking into the history of the Blackwood family. I was told that your family might have some connection to them." The woman's expression hardened, and for a moment, Sarah thought she was going to slam the door in her face. But then she sighed and stepped aside. "You'd better come in." Sarah followed the woman into the house, which was filled with antique furniture and old photographs. The woman introduced herself as Margaret Grayson and led Sarah to a sitting room, where they sat down across from each other. "Why are you asking about the Blackwoods?" Margaret asked, her tone guarded. Sarah took a deep breath. "I believe they were connected to something very important, something that could affect not just Willowbrook, but the entire world. There's a gateway, a portal to another dimension, and the Blackwoods were its guardians. But the gateway is weakening, and if it opens, it could unleash something terrible. I think your family might be the key to stopping it." Margaret's face paled, and she looked away. For a long moment, she was silent, and Sarah wondered if she had made a mistake. But then Margaret spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're right," she said. "The Graysons are descendants of the Blackwoods. My great-grandmother was Eleanor Blackwood, the only survivor of the fire. She changed her name and moved here to escape the past. But the legacy of the Blackwoods has always haunted us. Sarah's heart leapt with hope. Then you know about the gateway? About how to close it? Margaret nodded, though her expression was grim. The knowledge has been passed down through the generations, but it's dangerous. The gateway is protected by powerful forces, beings from the other side who will stop at nothing to keep it open. If we try to close it, they'll come for us. Sarah leaned forward, her voice urgent. We have to try. If we don't, the consequences could be catastrophic. Margaret hesitated, then stood and walked over to a locked cabinet. She opened it and pulled out an old, leather-bound book. This is the Blackwood Grimoire, she said, handing it to Sarah. It contains the rituals and incantations needed to seal the gateway. But it's not enough to just read the words. You need the blood of a Blackwood descendant to perform the ritual. Sarah's mind raced. Will you help me? Margaret looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. I will, but we have to move quickly. The longer we wait, the weaker the gateway becomes. The two women left the house and drove back to Willowbrook, the grimoire resting on Sarah's lap like a heavy weight. When they arrived at the Blackwood estate, the air was thick with tension, and the hum Sarah had felt before was now a low, constant vibration that seemed to resonate in her bones. They made their way to the stone foundation, where the sigil was still visible. Margaret opened the grimoire and began to read the ancient words, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Sarah watched as she pricked her finger with a small knife and let a drop of blood fall onto the sigil. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the air grew thick with a strange, oppressive energy. Sarah felt a wave of dizziness as the hum grew louder, more intense. She looked around, her heart pounding, and saw shadows moving in the corners of her vision, shapes that seemed to twist and writhe as if alive. It's working, Margaret said, her voice strained. But we have to finish the ritual before they stop us. Sarah nodded, her hands trembling as she helped Margaret recite the final incantation. The shadows grew closer, their forms becoming more solid, more menacing. Sarah could feel their presence pressing in on her, their whispers filling her mind with fear and doubt. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She focused on the words, on the ritual, on the hope that they could still save the town. As the final words were spoken, the sigil began to glow with a bright, blinding light. The shadows shrieked and recoiled, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The hum grew louder, more intense, until it reached a deafening crescendo. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The air was still, the silence almost deafening. Sarah looked around, her heart still racing, and saw that the shadows were gone. The gateway was sealed. Margaret slumped to the ground, exhausted but relieved. We did it, she whispered. It's over. Sarah knelt beside her, tears of relief streaming down her face. We did it, she echoed. We saved the town. But as she looked up, she saw the stranger standing at the edge of the forest, watching them. His expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of something in his eyes. Sadness, perhaps, or regret. You've done well, Sarah Mitchell, he said. But the final secret remains. Sarah frowned. What do you mean? The stranger stepped closer, his gaze piercing. The gateway is sealed, but the truth about what happened to Mary Jones, and the role this town played in her disappearance, must come to light. The people of Willowbrook have buried their sins for too long. It's time they faced the consequences. Sarah's heart sank as she realized what he meant. The town's darkest secret wasn't just the gateway. It was the lies, the cover-ups, the sacrifices made to protect it. And now, with the gateway sealed, there was no reason to keep those secrets buried. She nodded, her resolve hardening. I'll make sure the truth comes out, no matter what it takes. The stranger smiled, a faint, enigmatic smile, and then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Sarah watched him go, her mind racing with the weight of what she had to do. The town's secrets were about to be exposed, and she knew it would change everything. But she also knew it was the right thing to do. As she helped Margaret to her feet, She felt a sense of peace settle over her. The gateway was sealed, the danger was over, and the truth would finally be known. Willowbrook would never be the same, but maybe, just maybe, it could be better.